Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. Effectively securing your organization and its reputation requires a smarter approach. To maximize efficiency and minimize risk, security experts turn to Logarithm, the only leading solution built solely for security teams by a security team committed to your success. With Next-Gen SIEM, user and entity behavior analytics, network traffic and behavior analysis, security automation and orchestration, and compliance, Logarithm provides security made smarter. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. We've heard from our listeners that you're overwhelmed with content. If you feel that way, you can go to securityweekly.com/subscribe, join our listener list, and we'll notify you when exciting things are happening that you're interested in. If you're attending KubeCon and Cloud Native Con in Europe in Barcelona, May 20th through the 23rd, you can join your peers at the Cloud Native Transformation Summit hosted by SysDig. Our very own Matt Alderman will be emceeing that event. You can add it to your registration. Sweet.
I'm working on my Spanish now.
There you go.
It's actually Catalan, so it's slightly different.
Yeah. So, briefings update, jumping right into it. 42 Crunch. Matt, I don't know what your assessment of the API security space is, but I think it's growing. I think API security, one, is a big deal because everything is an API now. You have your own APIs. You've got other people's APIs. It's really easy to leave out security and get it working, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem we identified years ago when we were doing some of the strategy work on the application side at Tenable. And we knew that as applications were going to get broken up into microservices, those microservices would communicate to each other via APIs, which created potentially a large gap in how do you protect an application? How do you authenticate the APIs? How do you know which APIs are even in use? How do you control which APIs can talk to what? So I agree with you, Paul, that we identified that this was coming and it's growing. And I think it only gets bigger as we go through digital transformation, where we are now distributing applications not only in a single cloud environment in multiple regions, but now across multiple cloud providers with on-prem. The proliferation of these APIs is going to make it really difficult to really understand how to secure all the components of the application.
Yeah, and 42 Crunch, in my assessment, makes it pretty easy to do that in your organization. There's still a lot of moving parts. However, they're very comprehensive in that they help the developers write good code. They help QA have good tests in the respective APIs, right? And then so when it gets to production, inherently it's more secure, but they can also do protection in production as well to prevent some of those attacks against your API. And they had, in my mind, the most comprehensive list of, they were very well versed in the very specific attacks and misconfigurations for your API. And that was probably the most impressive thing.
Yeah, I did the original briefing, I think, with them at RSA, which prompted you to do a deeper dive briefing more on the technology. And if I recall correctly, 42 Crunch allows you to actually define kind of the API and what the API is supposed to do, which is great for the developers and great for documentation on how your API is supposed to work. That allows QA to test it and then ultimately allows security to put some controls and protections around it. So it kind of spans across the development side and defining the APIs and its functionality, testing and making sure that they're there, and then also give that data over to security to help protect it.
Yep. Yeah, it's a big problem. I mean, everything is talking to applications via some type of API, your mobile phone app, your web application, whatever. And there's just so many things that you can miss, you know. And when I got the demo, they really helped you get a handle on all that stuff, which is awesome. So speaking of getting rid of the password, I think Viridium, I don't know if that's necessarily their messaging, but they did have some really cool authentication technologies. And so basically they use some type of biometrics to validate the first level of the user. And then your second factor is essentially your phone, right? There's a unique token on your phone. And there's a few different vendors that are out there. My general concern, and I have lengthy discussions with all the vendors in this space, is what happens if someone compromises my phone, right? We already saw in some certain Qualcomm chipsets, it could allow an attacker to get into that trusted key store, which is where you'd store those secrets. But it's all, I mean, yeah, it is hardware, but there's software involved as well, and we all know software can be vulnerable. So that's one of my concerns. If you're relying on a phone to do your authentication, it comes down to the security of that phone, right? And there's a ton of vendors that do it this way. It is much more convenient for the end user not to have some kind of physical token, and not to have all these hoops to jump through. The cool part about Viridium is they had the finger. You take a picture of your 4 fingers, and it reads the fingerprints off of that picture and uses that as your biometrics. If you, for example, rather have a smartphone that doesn't have facial recognition or a fingerprint reader on it, they've got patented technology. You take a picture of your fingers, and that it uses that to validate you. So I thought that was great. I'm all for getting rid of the password, and I really like their technology.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of technologies in this space trying to eliminate the password. There's a couple that are trying to eliminate the username and the password altogether, right? We know username password's not effective, so we've layered on multi-factor authentication. We've done single sign-on. We've done password vaults and all the other things that we've done. It's made it really, really complex. That's why I said this whole identity space is very intriguing to me, because as the attack surface, right, as our perimeter moves to the end user, the person, these are the technologies that are going to help us solve that shifting perimeter. And so technologies like this, I think we're going to continue to see more in this area. I think there is some really early stage innovative stuff that might surface soon, and it'll be really interesting to watch how this market plays out.
It seems to me it's pretty easy, although I haven't done it, but basically it uses SAML to hook the authentication. So configuration, from what I've seen so far, having done a few demos and briefings, is pretty straightforward, right? Because you just basically you tell Google G Suite or Active Directory or whatever, like, here's your SAML server to use for authentication, and that's how a lot of vendors are doing it, which is good. Oh, and they also have this thing too, where they do they have some other kind of technology and a patent, I'm assuming, how you hold your phone, right? You can turn this feature on and off. If you want some extra validation, you can say, pay attention to how the user holds their phone and develop a baseline. And then if they deviate from that, ask them for additional authentication credentials, right? Ask them to do something. Maybe you're going to call the help desk. Maybe you have to enter your password, right? That kind of thing. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and I know there's a couple more out there that's doing it, so it'll be interesting to see who has which defendable patents at the end of the day.
It's true. Whitecanyon. This one, it was really interesting to me because it's not your traditional security vendor, right? This is solving the problem when you have old computer equipment or old technology, you want to get rid of it, right? And what do people do? I mean, some people do wipe it with software. Some people throw it in the dumpster, smash it with hammers, drill holes through it, and all those things. Then you have to worry about the cost of disposing of that stuff. And then some companies are like, well, we don't want to incur the cost of destruction, and we don't want to sell it because someone could get our information off it, so we'll just store it. And for you personally, that may not be a lot, but think about an organization that has 20,000 people, and they each could have multiple devices that at some point go end of life. What happens to them, right? Storing them is expensive. Destroying them can be expensive. So what Whitecanyon does is gives you tools and a process, a framework, right, to log and capture that when a laptop, for example, goes out of service, it gets run through the software. Then the software updates in a database and says, yes, this asset was in fact wiped. And then now what companies are doing is they're either selling the gear, right? Think about a 2 terabyte SSD, right? You can only smash that so much. Like, and you got to like drill holes through the right parts, right, to destroy the flash on it because they're solid state. Now they can resell that. And, you know, maybe that drive can sell for $50. And you're like, well, that's not a lot. They've got 10,000 of them, right? And they can't just go put them up on eBay without ensuring that your data has been wiped clean off of it. So I thought that was cool. Oh, they tell the story of the mayor. So apparently the pawn shop got this computer and did recovery, and turns out it was the mayor's computer and found interesting things on it. So you definitely want to make sure that you're destroying it. And a lot of companies just don't have a process for this, right? Or if they do, it's just, you know, stored in that storeroom, in the stock room, and it gets really full really fast. And then you got to get more, and storage is expensive. So this software was really cool, and I think kind of a different take, Matt, on an enterprise security front.
Yeah, I mean, you know, how do you get rid of old equipment? Every corporation has to deal with this at some point. You know, you got 3-4 year refresh cycles. You've got all this equipment laying around with data on it. You want to make sure that, you know, you don't want to store it, but you want to make sure it's securely wiped before you get rid of it, so none of your confidential data is getting out. I mean, this is, you know, part of that data side of the equation. You know, that there's a little different spin on it,
right,
but it's making sure the data is completely wiped before it gets out.
And I liked the economics behind it, Matt, because if you can sell it and or donate it, right? Selling it, obviously, you recoup some of your investment. Donating it, you can take a tax write-off potentially. In all those, the other methods are really expensive. And they also support USB drives. So that means you can connect, I think he said 8 or 16, some multiple of 2, right? Flash drives at one time, and it'll wipe all of them in one fell swoop, which, you know, you can't forget about flash drives either. And I think a lot of that comes down to building processes and policies around how you get rid of the data. And a tool like this helps save you time and money.
Yeah, and keeps an inventory of it, so you know that it actually was done, it got checked off, validated, and now you know you can get rid of it.
Absolutely. Eclypsium, talked a little bit about this maybe Monday. I might have mentioned it. And this, you know, kind of begs another question. If you are responsible for security in an enterprise today, have you looked at every single one of your computer systems and what type of firmware might be inside of the various hardware components and subsystems, right? Your motherboard, your graphics card, your network card, all of those things have firmware, which is essentially software. And what I find is most organizations don't have a good handle on what all of those subsystems are doing. They don't have a good handle on what's out of date, what's not. And you really need a system to do this. And I think Eclypsium has a really great solution for this. The founders came over from Intel and are some of the most technically brilliant people that I've done briefings with. And I think also as the attack surface changes, we're seeing this already, right? Your remote access embedded devices that are essentially in, like Dell used to call it DRAC or Dell Remote Access. HP has had Insight and Lights Out, and it's gone through multiple iterations, right? Those are another subsystem inside of your existing desktop, mostly servers, right, in that case. And I think as your security maturity level improves, this might be something you need to start looking at. Even if it's not, you probably need to start looking at. But I think we tend to think of the most advanced adversaries that want to go after this type of problem and have persistent malware on the system so that when you wipe the drive, it just reinfects you, right? And I think as organizations get better, which I unscientifically, I see organizations getting better at reducing that dwell time. If an attacker can just go after the operating system and doesn't need to have custom firmware in the malware and they're accomplishing their goals, that's great. What this does, though, is really makes that dwell time very important, because if I'm an attacker, the first thing I might do when I get on the system in the first couple of minutes is infect that firmware, right? Then if they detect me, that's fine. Like, wipe the drive, I'm gone. I'm going to reinfect, and maybe I have something in my malware that says, hey, they found me with this technique, so let me use this other technique to reinfect the system. And I think this is a problem that we're facing today, and it's going to become more prevalent. We've seen lots of stuff in the news about attackers going after these firmware-based systems, attacking the software, right, that each provider, each OEM has, that crappy software to update firmware or update the subsystems. And it's just going to, I think, be abused, but also it has to be balanced with dwell time. If they can't get into the firmware, right, and you're catching them early on in the phase, it's much better. If you're not catching them when they're infecting the firmware, you could put all those controls in place, and the attackers are just going to bypass it.
So, Paul, how does this apply into IoT? Because those are firmware-based systems. We've talked on Paul's Security Weekly about some of the attacks with some of the home devices, right?
Yep.
Which could be firmware-based.
It's interesting.
Does this allow you to look at that?
So what they do is they detect all the systems and versions, right, in your environment. So that means I've got 10,000 computers deployed. How do I know what firmware I even have? And then your next logical question is, does that firmware need to be updated? And then the next logical question is, if it needs to be updated, are there vulnerabilities associated with it? And then once you get to that point, your next question is, has someone put malware inside of that firmware already, right? And that's they solve all those problems for you. And what they do is they've got, like 1 million firmware samples, and they just do a compare and contrast, right? If they can get clean firmware, then that's good. If the firmware changes and doesn't match that signature, they're going to flag on it. They've got other ways in which to detect, malicious types of firmware using comparisons. For example, if you've got 100 servers and one of those servers, the firmware is different, but it didn't match any malware signatures and it didn't match any, code signing certificates or whatever, but it was different from the other 99 in your pool, that could be indicative of a problem. So they're coming at it in a very smart approach. And I think it's a huge gap in organizations today. They very closely couple with patch management systems. I looked at that during the briefing. I said, they want to be focused on the firmware aspect of it and let the other vendors do the patching of all the third-party apps and operating systems. So having this integrated into your patch and configuration management, I think is fantastic. Also, what I like is they are addressing the operational concern and the security concern. If take us as an example, we've got lots of hardware inside of systems that has firmware that needs to be updated. How do I know it needs to be updated? And operationally, I need to build a plan to install all of those fixes. If I don't have a tool like this, it's a very manual process, right? You're scripting something and not getting close to the coverage that Eclypsium has. So I thought it was my best briefing in some time. So guys are awesome.
It's hard enough to patch our operating systems, let alone all the firmware on those systems.
And I think that's where a lot of people are at today, right? I can't keep up with all my OS and applications. Now I got to worry about firmware. If you streamline that in the same process, it's going to be much better. Because, a lot of times we're looking at firmware updates to make something work or fix a bug that's disrupting production. But at the same time, we have control over that. If there were malware inside of it, the end result is pretty much the same. My production system is offline, except now I've got incident response to deal with and some other issues like how it got there, right?
Yep.
And it can come from the manufacturer. We saw that with, was it Supermicro? We've seen that a few times where it comes from the factory already backdoored. And that's why I liked their approach of saying, well, if this firmware has a variance on it, then, they can catch it. So they've got some other ways if an attacker is able to produce firmware that either isn't signed or replicate the code signing cert for that. That's all software too, and that can be bypassed. And they actually have some papers on bypassing some of these protection mechanisms to update firmware. So,
great way to check for all your embedded Chinese malware.
Yes. And actually, a lot of attackers have campaigns now that are doing this. So I think it's becoming more prevalent because it allows for that persistence. That will round out the show for today. I want to thank everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next week on Enterprise Security Weekly.